September 19, 1944. Near the small French town of Arracourt, a battle unfolds that, on paper, should never have gone the way it did. On one side, the German Fifth Panzer Army, hundreds of tanks, including the feared Panthers, fresh from the factory, with thicker armor and longer-range guns. On the other, an American force with fewer than 100 M4 Sherman tanks, outgunned, out-armored, and by every technical metric, inferior. And yet, when the fighting ends, the Germans have lost around 200 tanks, the Americans, roughly 25. This is not a story about a better tank. It's a story about how an army that once collapsed under pressure rebuilt itself into a machine that could dismantle Germany's elite armored divisions. To understand Arracourt, you have to go back to February 1943, to the moment when the United States Army was humiliated in the deserts of North Africa at the Kasserine Pass. At Kasserine, around 6,500 American troops were routed in less than a week. Units broke apart, command structures failed, communication collapsed. German forces, led by experienced panzer commanders, sliced through American lines with precision. It wasn't just a defeat, it was exposure. The U.S. Army, newly arrived in the European theater, was unprepared for modern mechanized warfare. German doctrine at the time was brutally effective. Their panzer divisions didn't fight as isolated tanks. They operated as integrated combat teams, armor working in sync with infantry, artillery, and air support. They moved fast, struck hard, and exploited confusion. American forces, by contrast, were rigid. Tanks advanced without proper infantry support. Artillery coordination was slow. Air support was inconsistent. Orders moved down long chains of command, often arriving too late to matter. The result was predictable. American units were outmaneuvered, outcoordinated, and outclassed. But what makes this moment extraordinary is what happened next. 17 days after the disaster at Kasserine, the process of transformation had already begun. Not in years, not in months, in days. Commanders were replaced, training was overhauled, doctrine was rewritten in real time. Leaders like George S. Patton were brought in, not because they had perfect answers, but because they understood something fundamental. Modern war was not about individual units fighting well, it was about systems fighting better. The U.S. Army began to abandon the idea that tanks alone could win battles. Instead, they embraced combined arms warfare, an approach where infantry, armor, artillery, and air power operated as a single coordinated force. Tanks would no longer charge ahead blindly. Infantry would protect them from close-range threats. Artillery would suppress enemy positions before contact. Aircraft would strike targets beyond the horizon and disrupt enemy movement before it even began. Communication became a weapon. American tanks were equipped with reliable radios, allowing units to adapt in real time. Field commanders were given more autonomy, encouraged to make decisions on the spot rather than wait for orders. Flexibility replaced rigidity. Initiative replaced hesitation. And perhaps most importantly, the U.S. Army learned to fight the enemy's system, not just their machines. Because the truth was, German tanks like the Panther were formidable. Heavily armored, with powerful guns, they could destroy a Sherman at long range. But those advantages depended on conditions: clear lines of sight, coordinated support, stable supply lines. Disrupt the system, and the advantages begin to disappear. The Americans started to understand this. They didn't need a better tank. They needed to break the way German tanks were used. So they trained differently, they planned differently, they fought differently. They learned to use terrain, weather, and speed. They emphasized ambush over confrontation. They integrated artillery strikes into every engagement. They called in air support not as an afterthought, but as a core part of the battle plan. They turned logistics into a weapon. keeping vehicles running, repairing damage quickly, and ensuring that units could stay in the fight longer than their opponents. What emerged from the wreckage of Kasserine was not just a better army, it was a different kind of army. An army that could absorb shock, adapt under pressure, and evolve faster than its enemy. By the time American forces reached France in 1944, the transformation was complete. The lessons paid for in defeat had been internalized. The system had been rebuilt. So, when the German Fifth Panzer Army rolled toward Arracourt, confident in its superior machines and experienced crews, it wasn't facing the same force it had defeated in North Africa. It was facing something new, an army that had already lost and learned exactly why. By 1944, the United States Army had come to a quiet but decisive conclusion. The war would not be won by building the perfect tank. It would be won by building a system that could outfight, outlast, and outadapt anything it faced. On paper, the M4 Sherman was not impressive compared to its German counterparts. Its armor was thinner. Its guns struggled against heavily armored targets like the Panther. Its silhouette made it easier to spot. Crews knew this. Commanders knew this. There was no illusion about its limitations. But what the Sherman lacked in raw power, the American system compensated for in ways that were far less visible and far more decisive. The first advantage was something rarely highlighted in battlefield stories: logistics. While German units often struggled with spare parts, fuel shortages, and mechanical breakdowns, American forces built an entire ecosystem around keeping tanks operational. Damaged vehicles weren't abandoned. They were recovered, repaired, and returned to the fight, sometimes within hours. Supply lines were not an afterthought. They were a strategic priority. Behind every tank on the front line was a network of mechanics, engineers, and transport units working continuously. If a Sherman broke down, there was a system in place to fix it. If a unit ran low on ammunition or fuel, resupply was already moving. This meant American units could sustain pressure while German formations gradually weakened over time. And then there was improvisation. Some of the most effective battlefield solutions didn't come from factories or high command. They came from individuals in the field. Soldiers adapted their equipment, modified their vehicles, and solved problems in real time. There are accounts of men with no formal engineering background, people who, in civilian life, sold liquor or worked trades, picking up welding torches and reinforcing armor, mounting extra equipment, or reconfiguring vehicles to survive the realities of combat. This culture of adaptation created an army that didn't wait for perfect solutions. It created its own. Another critical advantage was communication. American tanks were equipped with reliable radios, and more importantly, crews were trained to use them constantly. Information flowed quickly: enemy positions, movement, requests for support. Units could coordinate across distances, react to changing conditions, and execute complex maneuvers in real time. German tanks often had excellent optics and powerful guns, but their communication was more limited at the tactical level. Orders were more centralized, flexibility was constrained. In fast-moving engagements, that difference became critical. Leadership also evolved. Commanders like Creighton Abrams embodied a new style of warfare: aggressive, adaptive, and decentralized. Abrams didn't rely on rigid plans. He relied on momentum, coordination, and the initiative of his crews. Decisions were pushed down to the lowest practical level, allowing units to act faster than the enemy could respond. This wasn't chaos, it was controlled flexibility, a system designed to function even when conditions broke down. Training reinforced this mindset. American crews were taught not just how to operate their vehicles, but how to fight as part of a larger whole. Tankers trained with infantry, artillery units drilled in coordination with armored advances. Air support was integrated into planning from the beginning, not added as an afterthought. The result was something the Germans had not fully anticipated: an army where every component amplified the others.
A Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was part of a network. When it engaged an enemy, it wasn't alone. Artillery could already be targeting the same position. Infantry could be securing the flanks. Aircraft could be striking deeper targets to prevent reinforcements. And behind it all, logistics ensured that the fight could continue without pause. This system also changed how battles were approached. Instead of seeking direct head-on engagements where German armor had the advantage, American units learned to shape the battlefield. They used terrain to limit visibility. They maneuvered to strike from unexpected angles. They avoided prolonged duels at long range where enemy guns were most effective. Speed became a weapon. So did coordination. Even when facing technically superior tanks, American crews could create situations where those advantages were neutralized or even reversed. A Panther caught off guard, isolated from support, or forced into close-range combat was no longer an unstoppable force, it was a target. And while German doctrine had pioneered combined arms earlier in the war, by 1944 the balance had shifted. The American system had become more resilient, more scalable, and more adaptable under pressure. It could absorb losses, replace equipment, and keep moving forward. It could function in chaos. And perhaps most importantly, it could learn. Every engagement fed back into the system. Lessons were analyzed, shared, and implemented quickly. Mistakes weren't just acknowledged, they were corrected at scale. This created a feedback loop that continuously improved performance across entire formations. By the time American forces reached the fields and fog of eastern France, they were no longer relying on individual bravery or isolated advantages. They were relying on a system that had been tested, broken, and rebuilt. So when German commanders looked across the battlefield and saw Shermans, they saw familiar machines, ones they believed they could defeat. What they didn't see was everything behind them: the network, the coordination, the adaptability. The system that turned an inferior tank into part of something far more dangerous.
By the summer of 1944, something had shifted on the Western Front, something the German command structure was slow to fully understand. It wasn't just that Allied forces were advancing, it was how they were fighting. For years, the German military had relied on speed, coordination, and shock to dominate the battlefield. Their doctrine had fused armor, infantry, and air power into a single striking force. But now, that same principle was being executed against them at a scale they had never experienced. The difference was in the sky. The United States and its allies had turned air power into something far beyond reconnaissance or occasional support. It had become a constant, overwhelming presence, one that shaped the battlefield before ground forces even made contact. There were moments when this shift became undeniable. One of them came in the form of a massive aerial bombardment. 1,500 bombers delivering over 3,300 tons of explosives in just 90 minutes. It wasn't a precise surgical strike, it was systematic destruction. The head-F wasn't just to destroy tanks or defensive positions, it was to collapse the entire structure that made coordinated resistance possible. Roads were shattered, communication lines severed, supply points obliterated. Units were disoriented before the ground battle even began. For commanders on the receiving end, the psychological effect was just as devastating as the physical damage. Among them was Fritz Bayerlein, a highly experienced officer who had seen years of combat. After witnessing the effects of such bombardments, his assessment was blunt and enduring. The scale, the intensity, and the coordination of Allied air power had created conditions in which organized defense became nearly impossible. This wasn't the battlefield the German army had mastered earlier in the war. It was something new. Air superiority allowed American forces to dictate tempo. Fighter bombers roamed above the front lines, ready to strike targets of opportunity.
columns of vehicles, artillery positions, even individual tanks caught in the open. Movement during daylight became dangerous. Concentrating forces became risky. Even retreat could turn into a disaster if detected from the air. And this is where the system came together. Air power wasn't operating independently. It was integrated directly into ground operations. When American units encountered resistance, they didn't rely solely on their own firepower. They called it in. Coordinates were transmitted, targets marked. Within minutes, aircraft could be overhead, delivering precision strikes or suppressing enemy positions. This level of coordination changed the nature of engagement. A German tank unit might be technically superior in a direct fight, but it rarely got a clean fight. Before it could fully deploy, artillery might already be landing. Before it could maneuver, aircraft might already be attacking. Before it could regroup, communication lines might already be disrupted. The battlefield became layered with pressure. For German forces, this created a constant dilemma: stay concealed and limit effectiveness, or move and risk detection. Either choice carried consequences. The initiative, the ability to act freely and shape the fight, was slipping away. And once initiative is lost, even the most advanced equipment begins to matter less. American commanders understood this. They didn't need to destroy every tank directly. They needed to break the conditions that allowed those tanks to operate effectively. Air power was the tool that made that possible. It extended the reach of every ground unit. It compressed time between detection and action. It turned information into immediate force. The result was a battlefield where German units were increasingly reacting instead of acting. And this had a cumulative effect. Each disrupted movement, each destroyed supply convoy, each failed attempt to coordinate, these weren't isolated incidents, they compounded. Over time, they degraded the effectiveness of entire divisions. Crews became fatigued, commanders became cautious, plans became harder to execute. What had once been a highly synchronized system began to fragment. Meanwhile, American forces continued to refine their integration. Air-ground coordination became faster, more reliable, more routine. What had once required careful planning could now be executed almost instinctively. By the time battles like Arracourt began to unfold, this integration was no longer experimental, it was standard practice. So when German units advanced, they weren't just facing tanks and infantry, they were entering a battle space already shaped against them, where visibility was compromised, movement was dangerous, and every action risked immediate response from above. The sky itself had become part of the battlefield. And in that environment, the traditional advantages of armor, thick plating, long-range guns, superior optics, were no longer enough. Because before a shot was even fired, the system had already begun to dismantle them.
By September 1944, all the elements were in place. The reformed doctrine, the integrated system, the dominance in the air. It was all about to be tested in one of the most unlikely battlefield outcomes of the war. The setting was the Battle of Arracourt. At first glance, it looked like a straightforward German opportunity. The Fifth Panzer Army was preparing a counteroffensive. Among its forces were large numbers of Panther tanks, arguably some of the most advanced armored vehicles of the war. Thick frontal armor, high-velocity guns, superior range. In a conventional engagement, they held the advantage. Facing them was Combat Command A of the U.S. 4th Armored Division, equipped largely with M4 Sherman tanks, lighter, less armored, and vulnerable in a direct duel. But Arracourt was not a conventional battlefield. The terrain mattered. Rolling countryside, broken by ridges and small villages, limited visibility. And then there was the weather. Dense morning fog that reduced sight lines to dangerously short distances, the kind of conditions where long-range advantages disappear.
American commanders recognized this immediately. Instead of pulling back or attempting to meet the German advance head-on, they leaned into the environment. They used the fog as concealment. They positioned their units in depth, creating layered defensive zones. They prepared to engage not at long range, where the Panther dominated, but at close distances, where reaction time, coordination, and initiative would decide the outcome. When the German advance began, it didn't unfold as planned. Units moved forward expecting to exploit their superior firepower, but visibility was poor. Coordination became difficult. Formations stretched and lost cohesion. Tanks advanced without clear knowledge of enemy positions, and then, suddenly, they were in contact. American forces struck from concealed positions, often at close range. Shermans, hidden behind terrain or masked by fog, opened fire before German crews could fully react. Tank destroyers like the M18 Hellcat used their speed to reposition rapidly, appearing where they were least expected, striking, and then disappearing again. One engagement became emblematic of the entire battle. A small group of American tank destroyers facing a much larger formation of Panthers. 4 vehicles against 14. On paper, it was a mismatch. In reality, it was an ambush. Using terrain and timing, the American crews engaged from advantageous positions, targeting vulnerable angles, coordinating fire, and maintaining mobility. The Panthers, powerful as they were, struggled to respond effectively. Limited visibility and disrupted coordination turned their strengths into liabilities. This wasn't luck, it was execution. Throughout the battle, similar patterns emerged. German units attempted to push forward, only to be engaged from unexpected directions. Efforts to regroup were interrupted. Communication broke down under pressure. The battlefield became fragmented, with isolated engagements replacing coordinated advances. Meanwhile, American forces maintained cohesion. They communicated constantly. They shifted positions as needed. Artillery was brought in quickly to disrupt concentrations. Air support, when conditions allowed, added another layer of pressure. Every element of the system reinforced the others. The fog, which might have been seen as a disadvantage, became a weapon. It neutralized long-range optics, it forced close engagements, it created uncertainty, and the American system thrived in uncertainty. German forces, built around precise coordination and clear lines of engagement, found themselves operating in conditions that eroded those strengths. As the days passed, the outcome became clear. German losses mounted, tank after tank destroyed or abandoned, not because the machines themselves were flawed, but because they were being forced into situations where their advantages could not be used. The system that supported them, communication, coordination, timing, was being systematically disrupted. American losses, while real, remained comparatively low. By the end of the fighting, the numbers told a story that seemed almost impossible at first glance. Around 200 German tanks lost, approximately 25 American. But numbers alone don't explain what happened. Arracourt was not a victory of armor over armor. It was a victory of doctrine over doctrine, of system over system. The German approach, once revolutionary, had become vulnerable when its components were disrupted. The American approach, forged through failure and refined through adaptation, proved resilient under chaotic conditions. And perhaps most importantly, it proved that superiority in war is not fixed. It can be reshaped. At Arracourt, the battlefield did not reward the strongest tank. It rewarded the force that understood how to fight as a whole, how to turn terrain, weather, communication, and coordination into weapons. And in that fight, the outcome was decided long before the first shot was fired.
By the time the fighting around Battle of Arracourt came to an end, the result forced a deeper question. How does an army with inferior machines consistently defeat one equipped with some of the most advanced armor of its time? The answer wasn't found in a single battle. It was found in the people who executed the system and the scale at which that system operated. Take Lafayette G. Poole. In just 79 days of combat, Poole and his crew destroyed or disabled 258 enemy vehicles. Not in a heavily armored breakthrough tank, not with overwhelming firepower, but in a series of M4 Sherman tanks, each one named In the Mood. His success wasn't just about marksmanship or courage, it was about awareness, coordination, and the ability to exploit every advantage the system provided: communication, support, mobility. Poole didn't fight alone. No American tanker did. And then there was Charles Carpenter, a former high school history teacher who took to the skies in a light observation aircraft, fabric-covered, slow, and never designed for direct combat. Instead of accepting those limitations, he adapted. He mounted bazookas under the wings and went hunting against tanks. It sounds improbable, almost reckless, but within the larger system it made sense. Carpenter operated where air superiority already existed. He relied on surprise, on mobility, on the ability to strike targets that were already under pressure from artillery and ground forces. His aircraft wasn't a standalone weapon, it was another node in the network, another way to apply force where it wasn't expected. These stories stand out because they're dramatic, but they're not exceptions. They're examples of a broader pattern, an army that empowered individuals to act, to adapt, and to contribute to a larger operational picture. And behind those individuals was something far less visible but far more decisive: production. There is a number that quietly reshaped the entire war: 49,234. That's how many M4 Sherman tanks the United States produced during World War II. Not prototypes, not limited runs, tens of thousands of operational vehicles supported by a massive industrial base that could replace losses, sustain offensives, and keep units equipped across multiple theaters. For German planners, including figures like Heinz Guderian, this presented a fundamental challenge. German doctrine had been built on the idea of qualitative superiority, better machines, better crews, better tactics. And for much of the early war, that approach had worked. But it depended on maintaining an edge. What happens when the opponent doesn't just match your tactics, but scales them? When they combine effective doctrine with overwhelming production, reliable logistics, and constant adaptation? The equation changes. A destroyed tank is no longer a decisive loss if it can be replaced quickly. A damaged unit is no longer permanently degraded if it can be repaired and supplied. Momentum doesn't stall, it continues, and over time that pressure becomes relentless. German units at this stage of the war weren't just facing an enemy on the battlefield, they were facing an entire system that extended far beyond it. Factories, supply chains, training programs, and command structures all working in coordination. Every engagement became part of a larger imbalance. Even when German crews achieved local success, even when they destroyed multiple enemy vehicles, the broader situation remained unchanged. The system absorbed the losses and kept moving forward. And that realization, gradual, unavoidable, began to erode confidence. Because the principles that had once defined German armored warfare were no longer enough. Superior armor didn't guarantee survival. Superior firepower didn't guarantee victory. Even superior tactics, when isolated, couldn't overcome a system designed to integrate everything at once. At Arracourt and in battles like it, that shift became visible, not as a sudden collapse, but as a pattern. Attacks that failed to achieve objectives, units that couldn't coordinate effectively under pressure, losses that couldn't be replaced at the same rate, opportunities that closed faster than they could be exploited. Meanwhile, the American approach continued to function, flexible, connected, and scalable. So when we look back at those numbers, 200 tanks lost versus 25, it's tempting to search for a single explanation, a better decision, a critical mistake, a moment of luck. But the reality is more complex. It was the culmination of everything that came before: the lessons of defeat, the redesign of doctrine, the integration of air and ground power, the emphasis on communication and initiative, the industrial capacity to sustain it all. It was a system. And that system didn't just win battles, it changed the rules of how they were fought.